The microphone made a small sound before Rachel's voice came through it. A breath, caught and held, the kind you take before you say something you've been carrying too long. My name is Ewan. I was standing near the cake table with a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, watching my daughter dance with a man I'd known for 4 years and still didn't fully understand, when my wife took the microphone from the DJ's hand like she'd planned exactly when to do it. I'm 46 years old. I run job sites for a mid-sized construction firm in Asheville, the kind of work where you learn to read a structure by looking at it, where you can tell if a beam is going to hold before anyone tells you the math. 18 years married. 2 kids. A daughter getting married in a tent strung with lights in my sister-in-law's backyard, and a wife I thought I knew as well as I knew my own hands. I just want to say something, Rachel said, and the band went quiet, and 200 people turned toward her the way a field of sunflowers turns toward light it doesn't question. She thanked her sister. She thanked Emily's mother-in-law for the flowers. And then she said a name I'd heard 1,000 times over the past 6 years, always in the context of a job, a promotion. He's been so good to me, Gregory. She said, I want to thank Gregory Voss for everything he's given us. This wedding, this life. He knows what I mean. The tent stayed lit. The lights didn't flicker. But something in the air changed the way it does right before a storm you can smell before you can see it. You know that feeling, when a sentence lands wrong and your body understands it a full second before your mind catches up? That was me, standing by the cake, feeling my hand go cold around a champagne flute I would later remember I never once drank from that night. I want to back up. Not because the wedding isn't where this story lives. It is. That's where it broke open. But because you need to understand who Rachel was to me before you can understand what those 9 words did. We met when I was 26, laying tile in a house her cousin was renovating. She brought me a glass of water because it was 94 degrees and I looked like I was going to pass out on somebody's brand new subfloor. She had this way of noticing things other people walked past, a cracked step, a flickering bulb, a person quietly struggling. I married a woman who noticed things. For most of our marriage, Rachel worked reception jobs, then office admin, then finally landed a position as executive assistant at Voss Development 8 years ago. It was, by every account, the best job she'd ever had. Good pay, real respect, she said. Gregory actually listens to me. She told me once, maybe 5 years in, and I remember thinking that was a strange way to describe a boss, like it was a discovery, not a job description. I didn't think much of it then. Maybe you've done that too. Heard something that should have registered as a small alarm, and let it pass because the alternative, actually stopping to examine it, felt like more work than your life had room for. I had 2 kids, a mortgage, a job that kept me on site 12 hours some days. I didn't have the bandwidth to interrogate a compliment about her boss. If I'm honest with you, and I promised myself, telling this, that I would be, my biggest flaw in 18 years of marriage wasn't blindness. It was comfort with not asking. If something felt uneasy, I let it settle instead of picking it up. Rachel used to tease me about it. You'd let the house burn down quietly rather than admit you smelled smoke, she said once, laughing. I laughed too. I didn't think it was a warning about myself. I think now it might have been the truest thing either of us ever said out loud before that night in the tent. Emily was radiant that evening. 21 years old, married younger than either of us expected, but happy in a way that made the age feel irrelevant. Ryan, our son, 24, stood near the bar with his jacket off, watching his mother with an expression I noticed but didn't understand. Not that night. I'd understand it later. I'd understand a lot of things later. Rachel's toast wasn't long. Under a minute, maybe. But there's a particular kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of everyone in the room doing math at the same time. I watched my sister-in-law's face change. I watched Gregory Voss, sitting at a table near the back with his own wife beside him, go very still in a way that a man only goes still when he's been caught holding something he can't put down fast enough. I didn't say anything. I stood there with my flute of champagne, and I smiled the way you smile at a wedding when you don't yet know what you're smiling through. I didn't know it yet, but that toast wasn't the worst thing I'd hear that night. It was only the first sentence of something that had been writing itself for 6 years, and I was about to spend the rest of the evening reading it one horrifying line at a time. Let me tell you what our life actually looked like, because I think it matters, not the version that makes sense in hindsight, but the version that felt, at the time, like an ordinary marriage doing fine. We had a rhythm. Coffee at 6:15. She left for the office at 7:40, always in the same navy Honda, always with her hair still slightly damp. I was usually already on site by then, pouring concrete or walking a framing crew through a punch list. We texted through the day, nothing profound, just logistics. Pick up milk. Ryan needs his cleats. Dinner at 7? For the first 10, 12 years, Voss Development was just a name Rachel mentioned the way you mention any workplace. Occasional venting about a difficult client, occasional pride about a deal that closed. Gregory Voss existed to me as a photo on the company website and a signature on Rachel's paychecks. Nothing more. Something started to shift, though I couldn't have named it at the time, somewhere around year 6 of her working there. She started dressing a little differently for work. Not dramatically, but noticeably, the kind of change you register without processing. New blazers. A haircut she didn't mention getting until I asked. She started saying "we" when she talked about the company. We're closing on the Baxter property. We think the market's turning. In a way that made it sound like she had equity in something beyond a paycheck. I noticed. I want to be honest with you about that. I noticed, and I let it pass, the way I let most things pass. If you've ever chosen not to ask a question because some part of you suspected you wouldn't like the answer, you'll understand exactly what I mean. The first real sign, the one I can point to now and say, there, that's where it started tightening, was a work trip to Charlotte for a developers conference. 2 nights, standard enough. Except she came home with a bracelet I hadn't bought her, silver with small amber stones, and when I asked about it, she said she'd bought it herself, treated herself, because the conference had gone well. I believed her, not because the story was airtight, but because believing her was easier than the alternative, and at that point in our marriage, I still thought ease was the same thing as trust. Ryan noticed things too, though neither of us talked about it at the time. He was 19, home from his first year of community college, working a summer job on my crew to save money. One evening he mentioned, almost in passing, that mom had been on her phone a lot lately, smiling at it in a way that made him feel like he'd walked in on something. I told him that was just how phones were now. Everyone smiled at their phones. I think about that conversation more than almost any other from that summer. He was trying to tell me something, in the only language a 20-year-old has for a feeling he can't name, and I closed the door on it without even realizing I was doing it. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house when one person is carrying something the others don't know about yet. You can't point to it. You just feel the temperature of a room change when she walks in from work, feel a beat of hesitation before she answers a question about her day that used to come easily. If you've lived in a house like that, you know the quiet I mean, the kind that isn't peace, even though it sounds exactly like it. Rachel started working later. Not dramatically, an extra hour here, a closing dinner there, but the pattern accumulated the way sediment does, invisible day to day, undeniable and aggregate. I asked once, mildly, if the job was getting harder. She said Gregory was leaning on her more since his last assistant left. He trusts me, she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a warmth, almost pride, that I registered and then, characteristically, sat down and walked away from. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever avoided a conversation because some part of you already knew where it would lead, and you weren't ready to live in that answer yet, you'll understand why I kept choosing the version of my marriage that let me keep sleeping at night. It wasn't stupidity. It was self-preservation dressed up as patience, and it would cost me 2 more years before I understood the difference. That Christmas, Gregory sent a gift basket to the house. Wine, cheese, a card signed, with gratitude for everything G. I remember holding that card longer than I needed to, feeling something I couldn't name, and then setting it on the counter and moving on with wrapping presents. Rachel saw me holding it. She didn't say anything either. Neither of us knew yet that we'd both just failed the same small test. I didn't know it yet, but that gift basket wasn't the last thing that would arrive at our house with his name on it, and the next one would be a lot harder to explain away. The year before the wedding, things sharpened. Not dramatically, nothing you could point to and call proof, but enough that even a man built for avoidance starts to notice the floor shifting under him. Rachel got a company phone. She said it was for after-hours emails, that Gregory wanted her reachable for closings that sometimes happened at odd hours. She kept it face down on the counter now. Always, a habit she never used to have. When it buzzed during dinner, she'd glance at it and not react. a stillness that felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced not reacting. I noticed the phone thing. I noticed and said nothing, and some nights I lay awake turning that nothing over in my hands like a stone I couldn't identify. There was a Tuesday in March I still think about. She came home late, said there'd been a closing that ran long, and when she kissed me hello, I caught something in her hair, not perfume, not hers anyway, something sharper, a cologne I didn't recognize. I said, "You smell different." She said, "Client's office was full of some diffuser thing, gave me a headache." I let it go. I want you to understand. I actually let that one go, out loud, in real time, even as some part of me flagged it and filed it somewhere I wouldn't look again for months. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is the part of the story where a lot of people would have already known enough to ask the real question, and I didn't ask it, not because I was oblivious, but because some quieter part of me had already started building a case I wasn't ready to read. If you've ever caught a detail that didn't fit and chosen, deliberately, not to pull that thread, you know exactly the kind of quiet I was living in. Ryan came home for a weekend that spring, and over beers on the back porch, he said something that landed harder than he probably meant it to. "Does Mom seem happy to you?" he asked. Not suspicious, just genuinely curious, the way a son asks about his parents when he's old enough to actually see them as people. I said she seemed fine, busy with work. He looked at me for a second too long and said, "Yeah, busy." I didn't ask what he meant by the way he said it. Emily, meanwhile, was deep in wedding planning, and Rachel had thrown herself into it with an energy that surprised me. Dress fittings, venue walkthroughs, a level of enthusiasm that felt, in hindsight, like overcorrection. I remember thinking, at the time, how nice it was to see her that engaged in something. I didn't ask myself why she needed somewhere else to put all that feeling. There was a moment, small, easy to miss, where Rachel almost told me something. We were driving back from a venue tour, and she went quiet for a long stretch, then said, "Ewan, if I ever did something that," and stopped. I asked her to finish the sentence. She shook her head, said it was nothing, some venue planning stress talking. I didn't push. I've replayed that unfinished sentence more times than almost anything else from that year, wondering what the rest of it would have been, and whether things would have gone differently if I'd just waited her out in that car instead of letting the silence win. If I had pulled over that day and asked her to finish what she started, everything that followed might have happened on different terms. Hers, chosen, instead of mine, discovered. That summer, I found a receipt in her jacket pocket while doing laundry, a hotel in Charlotte, a date she'd told me was a solo work trip to visit her sister on the way back from a conference. 2 nights, 1 room, 1 name on the reservation. Hers. I stood in the laundry room holding that receipt for a long time, feeling something cold settle into my stomach, and then I did what I always did. I put it back exactly where I found it, told myself there could be 100 explanations, and said nothing. That night at dinner, I watched her more closely than I had in years. The way she cut her food, the way she answered Emily's questions about flowers with genuine warmth, the way she reached over and squeezed my hand at one point for no particular reason. It didn't look like a woman living a double life. It looked like my wife. That was the part that unsettled me most. Not evidence of deception, but the total absence of anything that looked like guilt. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever looked at someone you loved and searched their face for a crack that wasn't there, you know how much more frightening that absence is than any confession would have been. I told myself the receipt was nothing. I told myself the cologne was nothing. I told myself the unfinished sentence in the car was nothing. Stacked together, they would have told a different story than the one I let each of them tell alone. I didn't know it yet, but the wedding was 5 months away, and everything I was choosing not to see was about to be said out loud, in front of 200 people, by the one person who could no longer carry it alone. Everything changed the week I helped Emily move boxes out of her old apartment 3 months before the wedding. I found Rachel's old laptop in one of the boxes. She'd given it to Emily years earlier when she upgraded, and Emily, moving out, was clearing junk before the wedding took over her life. Something told me to open it, an impulse I couldn't explain even to myself. It was mostly wiped, old photos, old files. But there was a folder of emails Rachel had exported years ago, before the laptop changed hands, and never fully deleted. I want to be honest about this. Going through those emails wasn't a decision I'm proud of. I told myself I was helping Emily sort files. That was a lie I told myself for maybe 4 minutes before I stopped pretending and just read. The emails were from 6 years back, early in whatever this was. Nothing explicit, not at first. Dinner invitations from Gregory that Rachel had accepted without mentioning to me. A thread where he told her she'd changed how he sees his whole life. A thread where she wrote back, "I don't know what to do with how I feel." I sat on Emily's bedroom floor holding a decade-old laptop and felt something inside me go very quiet, the particular quiet of a house right before a storm actually arrives. I didn't say anything to Rachel. I didn't say anything to Emily. I closed the laptop, put it in my truck, and drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever found out something true and had to keep functioning around the people you love while carrying it, getting up, going to work, asking your daughter about flower arrangements, you know that particular exhaustion. It isn't grief yet. It's the waiting room outside grief, and it is somehow worse. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention, not confronting, just watching. The way you'd study a structure you suspected was compromised before you decided how to take it apart. I noticed Rachel angling her phone away at dinner now, not just leaving it face down. I noticed she'd started taking calls in the car in the driveway before coming inside. I noticed a new signature on a credit card statement, a jewelry store in Charlotte, a charge she explained as a gift for Emily's bridal shower. I checked. Emily never received anything like it. There was a night, about 6 weeks before the wedding, when Rachel came home from what she said was a work dinner, and I asked, carefully, neutrally, how Gregory was doing these days. She paused, just a half second, but I saw it, before saying he was fine, stressed about a deal falling through. It was a small thing. It was also the first time in 6 years I'd watched her calculate an answer instead of simply giving one. I still hadn't confronted her. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sit with it myself, still. A man who found real evidence and chose to keep gathering more instead of asking the one question that would have ended the not knowing. Maybe you've done something similar. Kept collecting proof of a thing you already believed, because somehow having more of it felt safer than acting on what you already had. 2 weeks before the wedding, I drove past Rachel's office on a Thursday evening under the excuse of picking up a forgotten toolbox from a nearby site. Her car was still in the lot at 8:15. So it was a car I recognized from photos on the company website, Gregory's. I sat in my truck across the street for 11 minutes, watching 2 lit windows on the 3rd floor, telling myself there could be a dozen reasons, and knowing, underneath that telling, that I didn't believe a single one of them anymore. That was the moment the ground actually shifted, not the laptop, not the receipt, not the cologne. Sitting in that parking lot, I stopped being a man who suspected something and became a man who knew. And the difference between those two men is larger than most people understand until they've crossed it themselves. I didn't confront her before the wedding. I told myself I didn't want to blow up Emily's day. That was true. It was also a convenient excuse for a man who'd spent 18 years avoiding exactly this kind of collision, and some part of me knew I was choosing the excuse because it let me keep avoiding a little longer. If I had said something in that parking lot instead of driving home in silence, the wedding would have gone very differently. But it wouldn't have gone the way it actually did, and in a strange way, I've come to believe the way it actually happened is the only way the truth could have reached everyone who needed to hear it. So there I was, standing by the cake table, holding a champagne flute, listening to my wife thank her boss for everything he's given us in front of 200 people, including our daughter in her wedding dress. The silence after her toast lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt longer. I watched Gregory's wife turn to look at him, her face asking a question he clearly didn't want to answer in a tent full of witnesses. I watched Emily's smile flicker, not fall, not yet, just flicker, the way a bulb does right before it goes. Rachel handed the microphone back to the DJ like nothing had happened, and for one surreal moment, the band started up again, and people resumed dancing, because most of them hadn't caught the weight of what she'd said, or had caught it and decided, the way people do at weddings, not to be the one who made it a thing. But Ryan had caught it. I watched him walk straight toward Gregory's table, his jaw set in a way I'd never seen on my son. I got there before he did anything he couldn't take back, put a hand on his chest, and said, "Not here. Not tonight." He looked at me like he didn't recognize me for a second, like he expected his father to be as furious as he was, and instead found a man holding himself together with both hands. Emily found me near the gift table 20 minutes later, her makeup slightly smeared, asking in a voice I'd never heard from her, small and much younger than 21, "Dad, what did Mom mean?" I told her I didn't fully know yet, but that tonight wasn't the night to find out, and that I needed her to go be happy at her own wedding and let me handle whatever this was. She hugged me hard enough that I felt her shaking, and then she went back to her husband, and I never found out what she told him that night, only that his face, when I saw him later, had the careful blankness of a man who'd been told something and was choosing not to react to it yet. I found Rachel by the drink table an hour later, after most of the shock had quietly dissolved into the general noise of a wedding reception. I asked her, very simply, "What did you mean by that?" She looked at me for a long moment, confrontation reaction, cold admission, and said, "You already know, Ewan. I think you've known for a while." No tears, no explanation offered unprompted, just a flat, exhausted honesty that was somehow more devastating than any denial would have been. I felt something in my chest go loose, like a beam giving way under a load it had been carrying silently for years. Husband's reaction, emotional breaking point. My voice went on the first sentence I tried and didn't come back for a moment. I sat down at an empty table because my legs didn't feel entirely trustworthy, hands gripping my knees, and I didn't try to stop what happened next, which was that I put my face in my hands at my daughter's wedding and let something out that I'd apparently been holding since a parking lot 2 weeks earlier, maybe since a hotel receipt a year before that, maybe since a Christmas gift basket 4 years before that. Rachel sat down across from me. She didn't touch me. I don't think either of us wanted that yet. "How long?" I finally asked. She didn't flinch from it. "6 years," she said. "Since a work trip to Raleigh." "It wasn't," she stopped, started again. "It wasn't about him being better than you. I need you to understand that first, because I know it's going to sound like an excuse, and it isn't one." I told her I wanted to hear all of it. Not because I was ready. I don't think anyone is ever ready. But because I'd spent 18 months half-knowing things, and I couldn't survive one more version of half-knowing. She told me everything. In her words, "It started at a conference in Raleigh 6 years ago. I was standing at a hotel bar by myself because you couldn't get away from the site that week, and Gregory sat down and asked me a question nobody had asked me in years. What I wanted, not what I needed to get done. I told myself it was one conversation. Then it was one dinner. Then it was one night I've told myself 100 different stories about, none of them true. What I actually felt, that first time, was seen, which sounds insane to say about an affair, but I'd spent so many years being David's wife, the kid's mom, the person who kept the schedule, that somewhere I'd stopped being anyone Rachel recognized in the mirror. Gregory made me feel like Rachel still existed. I told myself once wouldn't matter. Then I told myself I'd stop before it became something. Then I told myself we were being careful, and careful meant it wasn't really hurting anyone. I was so afraid of you finding out that I stopped sleeping properly for months at a time. I was more afraid of losing this feeling of being someone again, than I ever let myself admit. The shame came in small, ugly moments I never told anyone about. I couldn't look at Emily's kindergarten drawings on our fridge the morning after Raleigh. I threw away a hotel key card in 3 different trash cans on the drive home because one didn't feel far enough. I tried to stop after Ryan came home from college and looked at me like he already knew something. I told Gregory it was over. It lasted 5 weeks. I don't have a good explanation for why it didn't hold. I just know that the day I stood up with that microphone, some part of me had already decided I couldn't keep lying at my own daughter's wedding. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I think I need you to tell me which. I didn't tell her which. I don't think I had an answer that night. Secondary characters that night each carried their own weight of it. Ryan didn't speak to his mother again before the reception ended. His loyalty, immediate and unambiguous, landed entirely with me. Though I'd learn in the following weeks that his anger wasn't only about Rachel. Part of it was directed at himself, for noticing something years earlier and saying nothing, the same failure he'd apparently inherited from his father. Emily's reaction surprised me, not siding entirely against her mother, but asking me, quietly, days later, whether I thought people could actually change, a question that told me she was trying to build room in her heart for a version of her mother she could still love. Gregory's wife left the reception within 20 minutes of the toast, alone, and I heard through mutual acquaintances weeks later that she filed for divorce before the month was out. His consequence arriving faster and more completely than mine did. We didn't finish the conversation that night. I drove home alone. Rachel stayed at her sister's. The weeks after the wedding were quiet in a way that had nothing peaceful in it. Rachel resigned from Voss Development within 10 days, not entirely by choice, since Gregory's wife's divorce filing became public enough that the company's board asked pointed questions, and Rachel later told me she wouldn't have been able to walk into that building again regardless. Gregory lost more than his marriage. Word in a town the size of Asheville travels fast, and within 2 months he'd stepped down from the firm he'd spent 15 years building, his name now attached, in every room he entered, to something he couldn't outrun. Rachel and I separated for 4 months. She moved into an apartment across town, and in that time I did something I'd never once done in 18 years of marriage. I let myself actually feel every part of what had happened instead of setting it down and walking past it. I went to therapy, which was Emily's suggestion, made gently, over a phone call where she cried more than I did. I told my therapist, in our first session, that my biggest problem in this marriage wasn't that Rachel betrayed me. It was that I'd made it easy to, by choosing comfortable silence over uncomfortable questions for the better part of 2 decades. Rachel asked to come back in the 5th month. She'd been in her own counseling, working, in her words, on understanding why she'd needed to disappear into someone else's attention instead of asking me, asking anyone, to actually see her at home. I listened. I believed she meant it. And I told her the truth, which is that I loved who she used to be, and I might even love who she was trying to become, but I couldn't unknow 6 years, and I couldn't build a life on top of that kind of silence again. The door was closed. Not slammed, closed, carefully, the way you close a door on a room you've decided you're finished living in. We're not enemies. We share grandchildren now, and holidays require a certain amount of careful choreography, but we manage it, mostly for Emily's sake, and increasingly, I think, because neither of us wants our children carrying our unfinished business into their own marriages. Looking back now, the red flags weren't hidden. The cologne in her hair, the phone turned face down, the unfinished sentence in the car, none of them were subtle once I let myself actually look. I called them coincidences at the time. I wouldn't call them that now. I understand, in a way I didn't at 40, that ignoring a red flag isn't the same as trusting someone. It's a decision, made quietly, to protect yourself from a truth you're not ready to carry yet. I made that decision more times than I can count, and each time, I told myself it was patience. It wasn't. It was fear wearing patience's clothes. The turning point wasn't the wedding toast, not really. It was the parking lot 2 weeks earlier, sitting in my truck watching 2 lit windows, when I stopped being a man who suspected something and became a man who knew. Everything after that was just waiting for the truth to find its own way into the open, because I hadn't found the courage to bring it there myself. I've come to believe something I didn't understand at the start of this, that silence isn't neutral. It isn't a pause while you wait for clarity. It's a choice, and it has consequences just as real as any lie, because every year I didn't ask a hard question was a year I was quietly telling Rachel that some part of me would rather not know than risk what knowing might cost. Rachel's affair wasn't about Gregory being better than me, not really, though I spent months believing that was the whole story. It was about a woman who'd spent so long being useful to everyone around her, a wife, a mother, an assistant, that she stopped believing she was allowed to be anything else, and found, in the worst possible place, someone who made her feel like Rachel again instead of just a role she was performing. That doesn't excuse what she did. It does explain it, and there's a difference between those 2 words that took me a long time to understand. What strikes me now, more than the betrayal itself, is how much of it happened in plain sight, hiding not because it was well concealed, but because I had built a life around not looking too closely at anything uncomfortable. I wonder sometimes how many marriages fail not because someone couldn't see the truth, but because somebody decided, quietly and repeatedly, that not seeing it was safer. Some of you have been in that tent, or somewhere just like it, watching your whole life reorganize itself around 9 words you never expected to hear out loud. Maybe you've been Rachel, disappearing into someone else's attention because you forgot how to ask for it at home. Maybe you've been Ryan, noticing something years too early and saying nothing because you didn't have the language yet. I don't think any of us come out of stories like this as villains or victims cleanly. We come out of them as people who finally stopped pretending, one way or another. If there's one thing I'd tell you, sitting where I'm sitting now, 2 years past that tent full of lights. It's that the cost of asking a hard question early is almost always smaller than the cost of letting it wait. I wish I'd asked Rachel to finish her sentence in that car. I wish I'd knocked on those lit windows instead of watching them from across the street. I didn't, and I paid for that silence in a currency I'm still spending down. I'm in a good place now. Not happy in the uncomplicated way I once thought marriage was supposed to make you, but freer and steadier, and finally, quietly, honest with myself in a way I wasn't for most of my adult life. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know, what's one word you'd use to describe someone who let you down, or a moment you saw a red flag and chose not to look at it? Tell me in the comments. And thank you for sitting with me through this one. It's the hardest thing I've ever told anyone, and somehow, telling it to all of you made it a little lighter to carry.